So I went and worked for Frank Martin, and he was a big Buffett fan, and so am I. And Buffett owned 8% of Coke, so he wanted to buy Coke. So he says, why don't you just look at it and tell me what's Coke all about? And I looked at Coke's balance sheet and income statement, and I said, well, where do they get their money from? They got their money from selling syrup to the bottlers. And they owned 49% of the bottlers. And, through the research, I discovered that they used to own 100%, but then they IPO'd Coca Cola Enterprises, CCE, and after the IPO, they owned 49%. And the accounting rules say if you own more than 51% and you sell syrup to the subsidiary, you can't recognize any profit on it. But if you own 49%, you can recognize 51% of the profit because that's sold to outsiders. And it wasn't so much about the syrup, it was about the bottling plants. Because when they IPO'd CCE, Coke still retained the bottling plants. So they would sell the bottling plants to CCE at 3 times book value. And of course, all the IPO money was transferred upstairs to Coke. And eventually, when CCE ran out of money, they would just transfer the bottling plant plus the debt that was on the bottling plant. And so you looked at Coke's balance sheet, which was fairly pristine, and then you looked at CCE's balance sheet, which was just terrible. The return on assets was 1%, 2%, and it was laden with debt, and 2/3 of it was not goodwill. They didn't call it goodwill. They had a fancy name for it, franchise rights. So 2/3 of the balance sheet's franchise rights, and then I'm saying, why would they overpay for these bottling plants? Because if you have a 1% or 2% return on assets, you've overpaid for something on that balance sheet. And I thought, well, the board, who's taking care of CCE's shareholders? And I looked at the board, and Buffett's son was on the board, and was he protecting CCE's interest or Coke's interest? Well, we know he protected Coke's interest. John Kelly or something like that, he was the chairman of the International Olympic Committee, sat on CCE's board, and Coke was an Olympic sponsor. And SunTrust, who had also about an 8% interest in Coke, they had 2 representatives, and then Coke had a CFO and somebody else on it. So, and Emory University, who owned more than $1 billion worth of Coke stock, had a representative on CCE's board. So when I added up the Coke holdings of the people, and even if you exclude Howard Buffett's connection, even if you exclude that, it still came to about $4 billion. So they had a major interest in Coke, but they were sitting on CCE's board. They had virtually no. Summerfield had a decent holding in CCE because I think he was the original owner. But he was just happy to go along with whatever the board members did. So they obviously overpaid for that. And I just said, you can't continue that. And the funny thing was, if you looked at Coke's balance sheet, they made it very clear that they're not underwriting CCE's debt. But CCE's debt had a AAA rating. So the whole thing was just obviously there. And I wrote an article about control, de facto control and control as defined by the accounting rules. According to the accounting rules, Coke did not have control. 49% you don't have control. But scratch the surface, they totally controlled CCE. And so I wrote a story and say, Coke should be consolidated so that all these profits, because they made a profit on the syrup, and CCE couldn't buy anything. They had to buy the trucks, they had to buy the marketing material, the packaging material, the syrup, everything, the sugar, everything they bought from Coke. And Coke made a little profit on all of that. And then Coke made money selling the bottling plants, which was quite a big part of their earnings. And then they made money through the line item equity income, which obviously was not going to last for long because you steal money from your children, eventually they're going to run out of money, and overpaying on assets, it's just not going to work. And then there's another little quirk in the consolidation rules that if CCE issues stock and Coke's interest reduces from 49 to 48, then they are deemed to have sold 1% of their holding in CCE, and then they can recognize that gain. So that was a few pennies to EPS as well, but it had no economic substance. So I wrote an article on that, and my boss sent it to Jim Grant, and Jim Grant had just written about CCE. But he said, Albert, I didn't, it was only when I got your article and I saw the analysis of the board that the lights went on. And he said that was one of the best articles I've ever published in Grant's Interest Rate Observer, was your Coke story. And then Connie Hayes at the New York Times got hold of it, and because she had just written a bullish article on the Coke and its bottlers, and she just followed the Wall Street analyst idea that this was ingenious, to offload the bottling plants to the bottlers so that Coke is just a clean, mean machine. And she thought, when she read it, she realized, wow, this is a different take altogether. And Melody Peterson actually wrote the story about Coke putting fizz in its earnings or something like that. And the board members came down on Melody Peterson and the New York Times. I got the inside information. They weren't happy. They thought this was scandalous that the New York Times would do that. But in 2002, Buffett told Barron's I should have sold Coke in 1998. But my holding was just too big. And the funny thing was, Coke, CCE never spoke about EBITDA. They spoke about cash operating profits. And if you looked at the cash operating profits, it was always 14.8, 14.9% of revenues. And somebody would have said, oh, well, they're producing a lot of cash flow. But there was one line item called marketing support payments, which Coke gave CCE. And Coke's logic was that CCE would do all kinds of promotions for Super Bowl and so on, and they would help CCE with that, and so they give them marketing support payments. And I mean, it sounded good on the face because it was like $100 million in 1991 or 92, but by 1999 it was more than $1 billion. And so if you take out the marketing support payments, the cash operating profits, EBITDA to revenue, was like 5%, 4%, 3%, 2%. And only when you put the marketing support payments in would the ratio magically be 14.89, 14.92%. And the board member, which was the magazine at the time that went to every board member on the S&P 500, did a massive story on it, Coke's secret accounting formula. And that was very embarrassing for Coke because they were just that had nothing to do with marketing support payments. It was profit equalization payments. So the whole thing got exposed because they made CCE overpaid, and CCE wasn't making a return on the assets, but they had all this debt. And so Coke had to give the money back, and so the whole thing just fell apart. So the Coke's really, it had a split, but before the split, it was $88 on August the 4th, 1998, when that was written. And I said, I don't even think it's a $40 stock if what I'm writing is true. And the stock went down to $40, and I think it's above 40 now, and the return over the past 5 years was only about 9%, but the S&P was 11%. So Coke has been pretty dead money for the past 15 years.